Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great event on tap, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will have the opportunity to access it later on. Following today's webinar, we will be doing a Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. Got ahead of myself there. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for either of our panelists, please don't wait, don't hesitate. Just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions. And also at the end of today's webinar, we will be doing a drawing for two $50 Amazon gift cards. So please stick around. Hopefully you'll be one of our two lucky winners. All right, with that, we'll go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is From Zero to DevSecOps, How to Implement Security at the Speed of DevOps. Our speakers today are Jeffrey Martin, who is Senior Director of Product at WhiteSource, and Anders Wallgren, who is VP of Technology Strategy at Cloudbees. Welcome, gentlemen. Some of my favorite people. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Pleasure to be here.
Pleasure as always. It's always fun.
All right, great. Well, I'm going to put myself on mute, take myself off camera, and Jeffrey, turn it over to you so you can do your thing.
All right. So, first, From Zero to DevSecOps, how to implement security at the speed of DevOps. A lot of buzzwords in there, so let's kind of dive in.
Bingo.
As I click, and nothing, there we go. Helps when I click the right button. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about, the shift from DevOps to DevSecOps. What are we doing besides adding letters?
Important letters.
I mean, they're really important letters, right? But other than making your resume look a little cooler, what else is going on? So look, there's a lot changing in the DevOps as a culture. But realistically, the way I see it, at least, is security is now being embedded in every single phase. So that's what this graphic's trying to represent, right? Security is now in everything and around everything. Anders, what does it mean to you, though, adding the second?
I mean, I think, so for me, first of all, I think security is an aspect, a big, huge aspect of quality. And so it has that same sort of aspect of, it's a measurement problem, right? How frequently do you measure? How deeply do you measure when you do measure, right? And if we think of the bad old days, kind of the waterfall days, which a lot of us are still in, not nearly, yeah, not nearly as many of us are as advanced as we would like to be. I mean, that's for sure. But kind of the old methodology of doing things is we kind of treat security as, we're in a restaurant and it's something that we sprinkle on the dish right before we serve it to the customer, right? Add security at the end, same way that we add performance and quality and stability and all of those other things right at the end, right? Because obviously those are things you can just pour on the top. That clearly is very wrong. I think we've realized, with quality in general and security very specifically, that it's not something that you achieve by accident, right? It is something that you achieve by going after it as a first class citizen in your feature set, and if you don't treat security as something that you bake in from the beginning, chances are you're not going to have a lot of it, and there's not a lot you can do about it towards the end. So along with all the other things that we're shifting left, we're going to shift so far left that the boat's going to tilt over. I mean, we're going to have to be a little careful, but it's definitely one of those things where, again, it's a measurement thing. So there's a frequency and a depth of measurement aspect to it, and the sooner you can start measuring, the better. I mean, that just seems like common sense to me.
Yeah, and I think it starts kind of all the way to the left, right, with design.
Oh yeah,
there's all those fun,
yeah,
the fun buzzwords. Security by design, and along with everything else like quality, performance, privacy by design. I do think it's interesting that security has been kind of one of the late comers to that shifting left. Quality, pure, good old-fashioned testing was one of the first pieces.
Yeah, and I think part of that you could probably, now this is just me theorizing, but I mean, I think part of that you can kind of look at as the siloing effect, right? I mean, the same way that, we've broken down a lot of silos or are in the process of breaking down a lot of silos, quality and dev, the silo between those two being one of the early ones that we hit with, with Agile and Lean and Kanban and those sorts of things, small batch sizes, all of that kind of goodness. I think quality was probably a little bit less siloed than SecOps is, or security, or even DBAs and data is still sort of one of those silos that's out there quite a bit.
A little bit of a specialty, so it's still kind of siloed off.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it became kind of it's the sign off that we need, right? It's that is a hurdle across which we have to jump, and you treat it like that, then it doesn't become part of your your kind of everyday experience and something that you bake in from the beginning. So there's definitely, I think, some cultural history there in terms of why maybe we're having this conversation about DevSecOps now and not, say, 3 years ago.
And to me, that's the big thing is, ops used to be a specialty, right? Security used to be a specialty. You'd have this specialist who knows all the stuff about security. And now we're democratizing that and we're spreading it out to everybody. Everybody is expected to have a base level of knowledge of security.
Yeah.
The same way that they have a base level of knowledge of quality.
I think that's a great point. And I think part of the reason why it is that way too is, and this was certainly the case with DBAs, and I'm pretty sure also with security people, it's the notion that what are you optimizing for? And I think a lot of organizations, if we look back across the decades, what we're optimizing for is the utilization of that resource, if I can use that to describe people. We want our DBA, who is very expensive, to be absolutely chock full of work all day, every day. Same for the security person. So we optimize our processes for that, which means the DBA has a line going out his or her cube of people that are lining up to get help with their data problems, or lining out the door of the office into the security people, right? Because what we were doing as an organization was we were optimizing for the utilization of that expensive person. That doesn't optimize for all teams having fast access to security skills when they need them, right? So I think the approach that we're taking a little bit in embedding security people in teams and having kind of full stack teams, not necessarily full stack individuals, because those are kind of unicorns, or they're kind of crazy people, or both. But full stack teams.
And expensive.
Yeah, no, exactly. And they burn out, and you get the hero complex and all of those sorts of things. But I think as we're starting to embed this a little bit more, the knowledge starts to diffuse and permeate, and I think that's a good thing. But I think we have to get out of that mindset of, there's, the doctor is in, that Peanuts cartoon with Lucy, the DBA doctor is in, and we all line up. And if I got to stand in line for 2 hours or 2 weeks before I can have my meeting to get my design approved, that's obviously very inefficient from the point of view of the team, and lends itself to big batch type operations where I hold off on that, long, expensive thing that I have to wait for until, it's too late.
I have to go with a ton into that line, right?
Yep.
Going to the doctor when you have many things wrong with you instead of just, a quick question. Exactly.
Yeah. But that's a little bit like letting the dishes stack up. It's just going to be that much more painful in the end.
Yep. All right. So kind of in that context, the common way of handling security issues. So I'll kind of start with how I view this, which is, we were just talking about it, right? Security teams analyzing, and then they have some process, emails, issues, tickets, forms, whatever they have. And that process of the security team analyzing and then prioritizing all of your vulnerabilities is long, closing things. There's too much back and forth of, is this closed yet? Okay, this is closed. Oh, wait a minute, that means the next priority is coming. This old way of doing things, or common way, isn't the best. It's what we were just talking about, the line to see the doctor.
Yep. I mean, I think you do need a process, right? Because there is going to be, you can do all the source code scanning, you can do all the third party, vulnerability detection and all of those things during your development process, but you can't stop doing that once you're in production, right? Because vulnerabilities may not be discovered until after you're in production. So You obviously need a process by which you do this on a continuous basis. And when something comes up, if it comes up in a security scan during the CI process early on in your development phase, that's one way of handling a problem. But then you still need that sort of reaction. That's more proactive. You still need the reactive way of operating when you discover a vulnerability that's already in production, right? First of all, you need to know what you have in production. And that's not necessarily easy, right? I mean,
no, just knowing what you have is the starting point of all risk mitigation.
Yeah,
but it's hard.
John Willis tells a great story about the Equifax breach, and tells the story in contrast with, I believe it was Fannie Mae, who took a very different approach to the problem, where when they found out about the vulnerability, the first thing they did was they shut down over the weekend all of the external access to their products, and spent the entire weekend just figuring out which products were vulnerable. And then a couple of days later had mitigated those vulnerabilities, right? So they took it seriously enough. Somebody was brave enough and was listened to say, hey, wait a minute, we got to shut things down and figure out where we're vulnerable here. Take that in contrast to the way the other company handled the problem, where they didn't even tell their CISO until a month into the whole process that there was this vulnerability.
And so much of that is cultural. Just somebody was empowered to be that brave.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
People were not avoiding bringing it up for any reason other than they were afraid to bring it up.
Yep. But it goes to show you that you do need both. You need the while we're developing, right? But you also need the post deployment, post production way of doing it, and you may handle those things differently, right? And
yeah, you presumably do, right? I mean, because obviously it's not really an attack surface before it's out in production usually.
Yep.
So it's you should have a different priority there. But
absolutely.
But it's kind of what we were just chatting here. But now I have a nice slide with some numbers on it. So it's not just the kind of emotional cost, right? Where it's harder to fix things that are in production because you got to shut down your production systems like you were just talking about, right? That's a huge cost, not just as a dollar figure, but as a, well, you got to be that guy brave enough to say, let's shut everything down. And then you have to have the execs bugging you why it's
a judgment call, right? You have to make a judgment call as to what is the right way to approach this so that I don't damage my customers, I don't damage myself, my brand, all of those things. These are not always straightforward, kind of what's the best approach. I mean, even just, the elephant in the room with COVID and the lockdowns and all of that, like what's the right thing to do? Close down the schools? Well, then healthcare professionals don't have, childcare for their kids. So what do? I mean, like these things are very complicated issues, and security is the same. How you react to a vulnerability, especially if it's something that's already in production, is the right answer is not always straightforward and obvious. So it's
but it's actually not a horrible analogy there, because it's not just a dollar figure. It's not just that catching things later, more towards the production or during QA is more expensive. It's also you're affecting more people.
Oh, yeah.
And at the end of the day, we all work in companies, and companies are made up out of people. When you're shutting down production, you're affecting everybody earlier in the cycle. You're affecting your customers, you're affecting every internal team for the most part. Whereas if you catch something in coding, it's affecting a couple of people who just have to quickly fix it. So a lot of times these types of charts always focus on the dollars, right? Because, we're all at the end of the day some level of salesperson, and we want to, convince people they need to solve this stuff early. And the best way to do that is to put a dollar figure on it. But to me, the biggest problem is the kind of personal emotional stake and the effect you have, the ripple effect on the rest of the people in the company.
Yeah, it's the opportunity cost of what you could have been working on instead of the mad scramble,
there's that too.
Heads, that you're doing. And there's obviously kind of hard costs and soft costs associated with these sorts of phenomenon. And, the hard costs are probably reasonably easy to calculate. The soft costs are a little bit more tricky, but they are, they're probably way bigger than the hard costs, because the ripple effect of, me getting pulled off of something, which means that delays something that somebody else is working on, and they tell two friends and they tell two friends, kind of a phenomenon. So
but what's funny is for security specifically, and I'm sure you've seen this with people you talk to, it tends to be some sort of big event, in production or something that triggers them to go and take it seriously. How do we
Well,
not have this happen again?
it's a human phenomenon, right? We didn't prepare very well for a global pandemic, as it turns out. We'll probably be better prepared for the next one. One would hope, right, that we learn some of these lessons. But it's been essentially 100 years, give or take 1 or 2 years, since we had the last global pandemic, the 1918 flu, right, or the 1918, 1919, and 1920 flu, because it went around the world, 3 times. But a lot of times, a lot of things in our lives that only happen once in our lifetime, hopefully, they're black swan events. You don't think that that's going to happen. You don't think that a tsunami that's going to kill hundreds of thousands of people happened, but that happened, 16 years ago. You don't think that there's going to be a giant earthquake that, takes out California. Someday that's going to happen, right? The black swan events do happen. So
there's one big difference with security, especially in code, which is there are bad actors trying to make these things happen.
This is a good point. This is a very good point.
So it's almost the worst case, right? You have people outside of your cycle and outside of your culture who are literally trying to break in and find these defects.
You have to deal with Lex Luthor.
And it moves at the speed of code, which nowadays is fast.
Yep. Yeah, it's interesting. I had a discussion with somebody just the other day about, how much detailed information do we put into release notes in terms of the security vulnerabilities that we're addressing, not necessarily in our code, but even just by picking up, third-party library updates, sort of supply chain management, if you will, of the software supply chain. And there was actually a discussion between reasonable individuals on, one arguing, hey, we disclose less because that way we don't give our enemies any information to work on. And I'm gonna just, put my hand up and say I was the other person arguing for more disclosure, because the bad actors don't need the information. They have tooling that figures this stuff out. And within 5 minutes of a 0-day being disclosed, or sometimes even before, because they find these things earlier, they already have the tooling to go figure out where in AWS these vulnerable systems are. They
probably know before you do.
Yeah, honestly, they know before we do. So to me, it's a responsibility of disclosure to our customers, or to their customers in the case of the company I was talking to. You're serving your customers better by giving them information that allows them to better decide whether they need to upgrade in order to address vulnerabilities, right? So I come down firmly on that sort of responsible disclosure kind of path, but people still have that conversation. People still think that, security by obscurity is a valid way of approaching the world.
Which
sometimes you have to train your way out of that.
That hasn't been true for a while, and I'm not sure. I'm always surprised we still have to convince people of that.
Yeah, but it's a very human thing, right? If I don't do something, that I haven't taken an active action to make things worse, right? It's a very, very human reaction of, well, if I just don't do anything, then I won't make it worse. Well, that isn't always true. But there's a huge psychological bias in the human brain towards status quo is better than, trying to make a change to the status quo.
100%. Plus, just fundamentally, we're all in the trust business nowadays. The people who buy your product or use your product have to trust you.
Yeah.
And people trust disclosure.
Yeah.
If I'm telling you something was wrong, I have nothing to gain, and I'm clearly being honest. I'm not lying that something was wrong.
Yeah, no, it always worries me a little bit when, you see a major new application release, or maybe just even an app on your phone or something, and I kind of wish that Apple and Google would just say, no more bullshit release notes. You guys actually have to list what you changed. The whole, we've made improvements and fixed bugs, don't even bother with that release note, right? Tell me what you changed. Give me a motivation to adopt that update. Assuming they're not automatic, which they probably should be in a lot of cases.
We improved the user experience in this area. What does that mean?
Yeah. Because the reason that I don't like that, aside from being a nerd and wanting to know the details and all of those things, is what that makes me think is the person that wrote the release notes doesn't actually know what went into that release. They have no idea. they
Which is
don't
probably
know.
the case in the big companies, right?
Yeah.
But
Oh
yeah.
yeah, no, and probably in the small companies too. I mean, you know, we don't necessarily have all of the systems tied together so that you can easily at the end of a release just say, hey, look, what went into this change, right? There's obviously great tooling out there to be able to do that, and many of us are doing that. But you know, but it's still a judgment call, right? Because you may have 1,000 commits in a patch release, right, or in a small
I mean,
release.
you always have to. It's like security. You have to prioritize what you're going to handle.
Exactly.
So I guess that's sort of we just sort of discussed all this, I think.
Yeah, we're pretty good at getting ahead of
I
ourselves,
know that's
which I
us,
don't see that as a problem, quite frankly.
right? No. Look, it's got a narrative structure here, so the narrative sometimes gets ahead. But yeah, we talked about speed delivery, secure by design. I mean, look, that's one thing I'm kind of passionate about.
Yep.
Is you can remediate in all of these phases. But at the end of the day, if you're not actually building security in from the very, very beginning, you're just putting Band-Aids on a bunch of open cuts.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's the difference between a vaccine and a cure, right?
Yeah.
They're both good things to have. Vaccines are better. You know,
100%.
yeah, that's just a fact. Not, you know, not that just by saying that makes it any easier for people to figure out what the heck that means in their daily lives. But what I mean is remediation is the cure, but seek the vaccine. The vaccine is improve your processes, shift your scanning left, empower your developers. You know, all of the things that we're kind of talking about today,
Right.
That's how you vaccinate yourself against problems, as opposed to wait for the vulnerability to be discovered and then have to remediate it, which is, you know, the cure. And it's important to have both. You know, you're going to experience both scenarios. It's important to be good at both.
Yeah, you can't just vaccinate, right?
Yeah.
That's not, yeah.
Yeah, that doesn't work when we discover new diseases, as we're kind of finding out. You know.
But you know, look, operations. I'm an operations guy at heart. I think, despite the fact I'm in product, and you know, we know culture drives the benefits. You know, the rest of the stuff is all obvious, right? You want to have DevSecOps deliver things like less rework, right? Obviously, the whole point is to identify vulnerabilities in code early.
Yep.
But the real benefit of putting kind of the sec in the middle of Dev and Ops is the culture. That piece where we're talking about security by design, but it's also everybody takes a little bit of ownership. It may not be equally spread. The ownership may be more on some people than others, like everything else tends to go.
Yeah.
You may have specialists, but at the end of the day, everybody has some level of ownership.
Yep.
And that's how you get the real operations moving.
Absolutely. I mean, specialization is absolutely key to everything in life, right? I mean, if you read the sort of the big grand books about, you know, economics and the development of society and all of those things, specialization is a major good thing. But specialization can also lead to siloing, and that isn't necessarily a great thing. I think, you know, one thing I would add to this, or sort of a slightly different spin I would put on this slide as well, is if you spend the effort to get good at automating and orchestrating your processes, right, so that you can quickly go to production with a small change. Really, you know, the question I ask people a lot is, okay, you're literally about to push the button to put the new feature into production, right? When you find a absolute showstopper bug, right? It's you know, it's going to cause mayhem if you let this thing go. For the sake of the argument, I'm going to say it's a one-line change in the code to fix, right? It's just a Boolean logic conversion, just one line change. How quickly can you get back to the point where you are now if you have to go make that change and then get back to where you can push the button to go into production? And the scary part about the answers that I get there isn't necessarily how long a period of time that is. The scary part is how often the answer is, well, we don't really know. You know, sometimes it takes an hour, sometimes it takes a week. You got, if you can get to the point where you're good at reliably, predictably, and frequently doing deployments, whether they're deployments into production or deployment into pre-production or even deployment for QA or development, getting good at deployment, getting good at that orchestration means that when you have an operational issue, when you have a vulnerability in your production environment, you know, you are good at the make the one-line change in the POM file to pick up the new version of, you know, struts, let's just say, not to pick on struts, but, you know,
sure.
You know,
It's
make
an easy
that
one to
one-line
pick on as
change
well.
to pick up the new version. let the CI process go, let the automated testing happen, push it into production, go, right? Maybe with approvals, maybe you sidestep some things because it's an emergency patch or whatever, but you do it in an automated fashion, and you've spent the time to get good at it, that you're not having to fat finger and do manual stuff and sidestep the process when you're under pressure, right? I mean, 3 a.m. with a bad vulnerability while you're actively under attack is a bad time to learn how to do this stuff quickly, right? I mean, it's
Yes.
There's a saying that I've heard a lot lately from multiple people, but it's, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time to plant a tree is today, right? Like, start today on getting good at that kind of stuff, because you do not want to be under stress at 3 a.m. with the systems down, losing 100 grand an hour with your boss breathing down your neck, trying to figure out how to manually do a deployment of one jar file. So, but that happens.
It's funny because actually one of our new employees asked me yesterday. They're like, "Okay, I know what a developer is. I know what an ops person is. What in the world is a DevOps person?" And I said, well, sometimes it's just a title, and it looks really cool on a resume compared to just ops, right? But real DevOps is focusing on the machinery of how you build and deliver code.
Yeah.
And that machinery has to have security in it. And the things that people, DevOps, quote unquote, really care about are things like repeatability, predictability, the things everybody who builds machines cares about.
Exactly.
And when they go to solve the security problem and embed it, what they care about is, how easy is it for me to add this to my machine, and how predictable and reliable is it going to be?
Absolutely.
And you don't want an unpredictable event happening at 3 a.m. and trying to fit a tool into your machine, using bubblegum and string, because it will not be predictable and reliable anymore.
Even the big giant, cloud vendors, Amazon, Google, all those folks, even they fat finger things occasionally.
Oh, sure.
Take down their own systems when they discover something new that they haven't found an automation for or remediation for, or something like that. So it's not something that just the small startups, kind of screw up because, we're inexperienced, or it happens to the giant corporations that are really good at this stuff. It happens to the giant corporations that are not really good at this stuff. It's a fact of life that there will be bugs, there will be security bugs, quality issues.
I have a saying I repeat probably too much, partially as a way of excusing my own mistakes, I guess. But the only way to make no mistakes is to not do anything.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. No, very, very true. Very, very true. The most secure software system in the world is the one that's not connected to the internet, right?
And never changed.
And never changed, right? So, hello world, line 10, hello world, line 20, go to 10, right? That was the last piece of software ever written. So, and even that, you could probably argue has some vulnerabilities in it. But yeah, I mean, it is a cultural thing. And I think part of what DevOps says too, and I always cringe when people have DevOps in their title, or when we have DevOps teams and so on. But I kind of stopped fighting that battle a little bit, because it's like arguing over the usages of words, right? The usages of words are out of our control, and whatever the world decides to do with them, they do. But what I do think about it is, it really, for me, it comes down to, think about it as one team, one fight, right? That what we're doing here as a software company, or even as a company that just uses software, right? We could be an automobile company, or we could be a pharmaceutical company, or so on.
And there is no company that does not use tons of software.
Right? Exactly. I mean, my refrigerator has software in it.
Yep.
So, but as as an employee at that company, when my customer discovers a problem, whether it's a bug or a security issue or what have you, they don't think, oh, that stupid developer, or that stupid security person, or that stupid DevOps person. They think that stupid company, that stupid brand, right? They don't drill down into the organizational dysfunction or function that got to that point. They just paint that whole company with the broad brush of they're idiots and they suck, right? And so you have to look at it a little bit from an outsider's perspective of, you got to have a process, and you got to have ways that you do things in, and people have assigned responsibilities and so on. But the goal of a software organization is to provide value to our customers, right? It's to provide secure, high quality software that adds some value to them, and in return for that, they give us, money, love, respect, whatever it is that we're looking for in return. But we have to understand that it's one team, one fight, right? They're not going to differentiate between, let me go switch to their competitors because I think they have a slightly better SecOps team. Like that's not how people think, right?
Your company reputation has one surface.
Yeah.
Right. Just one surface.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Reputations, take a long time to build up and they take moments to tear down.
Which is literally, we keep leading right into the next slide. You would think we know what's coming or something. Yeah, we were talking about it shifting to the development teams, but I mean, yes, it has to have an owner. All problems have to have an owner, but it is important to keep in mind, it's the entire company who's actually at stake. That reputation, that name, if you will, is the piece that's on the actual, responsibility. But day to day, you still have to have owners. So we did a nice little survey that's worth sharing here. Where does the ownership lie on software development? And I personally find this a little fascinating because it's still about a quarter to a third security teams and about a quarter to a third developers, with some people in between, right? You've got pure DevOps and some team leaders, so to speak. But that security team one actually is a little surprising to me, but not really, because a lot of people built this 5-10 years ago. They have a dedicated security team. They still have that team of specialists and they own it.
Yep.
But over time, this keeps shifting more and more towards the yellow, more and more developer ownership.
And I think it's, in my mind at least, it's maybe not so much a moving as it is a broadening, right?
Fair.
Because it's not like we're saying, oh, ops people, stop caring about security. The developers have got your back, right? That's not the situation we're really in. What we're really saying is, look, it is everybody's responsibility. Quality and security is everybody's responsibility, and we're going to enable you, empower you to help, to raise your hand and pull the big red cord when there are problems, whether you're on the left side of the life cycle or the right side of the life cycle or somewhere in between. And make sure that everybody understands on the team that only a team effort can produce the quality and security that we're looking for, right?
And it's funny because I'm a little passionate. I hate the word shift left. I just don't like it. One, it's buzzwordy. So. Yeah, but two, it's wrong because it's not shifting anything. We're expanding left.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that's a great.
We're not forgetting all the stuff we knew about like those should all exist. Your security team should all get fired and just say the developers now they're on their own. Like,
yeah, exactly. We solved that problem.
Yeah, no, they're specialists. They're enabling other teams. It's expanding what they know into the other roles. And that's, hopefully they're still there as the experts and the go-to resource and, maybe even sign-offs depending on what you're building. But, look, if I'm going to buy a pacemaker, I want a security specialist signing off on it. So that's fine, but it's expanding this, not shifting.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think part of it is, I think, a side effect of, we now have this, most of us have this thing we call the software pipeline, whether we literally have an automated pipeline that that's working really well for us, or whether it's more of a conceptual thing that we're working with lots of kind of islands of automation and trying to tie them together and those sorts of things. But, there's much better tooling out there. There are much better platforms out there for doing these things. If, a few years ago, I was working with a customer, it had taken them 2 years to get a piece of security software, scanning software integrated into their tool chain. 2 years, right? 1 year to acquire it, and then 1 year to integrate it into their tool chain, right? Because they had a very bespoke, homegrown system and all of those things. And part of what they realized out of that experience is building the tooling for this stuff is not our core competency. This is not what our customers want us to work on. This is not where our customers want us to innovate. They want us to innovate on our functionality. And let's use the tooling and the platforms that are out there, commercial, open source, what have you, or a mixture of, as most people do, a mixture of both. That's really made it easier, made it possible to say, look, yeah, we have a scan that we can do here. We can look at licenses, we can look at vulnerabilities, and we've been doing it, once before each release. And maybe we improved and we did it once a month, and then we do it once a week, and then you know, if it's fast enough, maybe we do it for every CI cycle. You know, if it's not fast enough, you know, we may have to push it outside of the CI cycle and have sort of a follow-up pipeline that does it. If it's, you know, if it's something that runs, you know, or is meant to run for a long time, longevity testing or those sorts of things. But you know, I think, you know, the idea that architecture matters, design matters, usability, user experience matters, right? I mean, you could definitely build a product where, you know, let's say that the product includes functionality where customers have to make security decisions, you know, access control and those sorts of things. You could do a poor design of that and make it easy for people to shoot themselves in the foot with the own security that, you know, you've given people in the product.
Yes, yes, you can.
This literally is an all hands on deck kind of experience when it comes to security and quality.
Absolutely. So we kind of just chatted about this, but realistically, it isn't just interesting to note, and we had the data, so I wanted to share that it's sort of happening all across every size company, right? The size doesn't matter a ton here. It's the same description. Realistically, it's because every big company is just made up of smaller organizations anyways, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, nobody's got a 5,000 person developer team that's not separated into different areas, but.
Yeah, exactly. I know that large 5,000 person team doesn't really exist.
No, it's just a
Not
bunch of smaller
anymore.
teams, right? At least not ideally. I've seen big teams and wondered how the hell they do it, but yeah.
No, I think, you know, and I think those numbers also in these numbers that, you know, they really kind of bear out that this is a shift in the industry. This is a shift in the platforms, the architectures, the tooling, you know, the products that are available, and that's very democratizing, right? I mean, subject to what it costs to acquire something and to run something, but that's very democratizing because I don't have to be a 1,000 person team in order to adopt these kinds of technologies. I can be a 2-person team and
the other piece is just customers don't care how big you are. It sounds silly, but they don't. And look, there are some exceptions there. Some people really like dealing with companies that are smaller because they can get more responsivity. Some people like dealing with the big guys because nobody gets fired for buying, you know, HP, right?
Yeah.
As the old saying went. But customers just want quality products that are secure.
Yeah.
and perform well. They don't really care how big you are, which means you need to kind of have the same deliverables no matter how big you are.
Yeah, and especially in the world of, you know, internet services and apps and those sorts of things. I mean, you know, as the old saying goes, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. Nobody knows that you're a 5-person company with a hugely popular app or website or something.
Matter of fact, you're probably not advertising you're a 5-person company if you have a hugely popular app, right?
Yeah, depending on who your customer segment is, you may not want that to be known. Because I mean, it is a trade-off, right? I mean, there's the perceived stability of a larger, more established company, and the perceived, often, you know, true on both sides of this kind of equation, the perceived flexibility of a smaller vendor or a smaller you know, organization.
Yeah, but it's never a good excuse for having an insecure product. I almost said
I don't think there are
instead of
any
insecure, right? You know, we're a small company. Nobody cares.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And you will remain a small company or cease to exist if you don't take security, you know, seriously, obviously.
Yes.
So, but I mean, as we've seen, even large companies don't take security seriously. So.
Well, and like we said too, you always have mistakes and things mess up, but at the end of the day, it needs to be a serious concern that is being built into the culture of development.
Yep. And I think that's great. And I think, you know, as long as we, you know, and I like the fact too that we're starting to get out of that mode of kind of the one throat to choke, you know, because I think it's, you know, it's easy from a management, you know, layer perspective to kind of say, well, that's the CISO's, you know, concern. And if something ever goes wrong, I'll just fire him, you know, or her. But that doesn't really solve the problem, and it doesn't.
It also doesn't actually help at all. Because all you have done now is just blame somebody for the problem. You still have the problem. Like, and look, blame is helpful. It's good to have somebody responsible and accountable for mistakes, but you can't just stop at the accountability.
And I think what you got to do is move fast past the accountability and move to the learning as quickly as possible, right? I mean,
yes.
And I think that's hopefully it's something that a lot of us do is when we have some sort of incident or problem, whether it be a quality, performance, security, you know, what have you, you know, mitigate, but then also do some retrospective on that, right? What is the cheapest, fastest, earliest way that we could have prevented, caught, or mitigated that problem, right? And you know, as the saying goes, and you know, it's straight out of your slide, basic slides earlier, basically, as the cheapest place to fix a bug is on the whiteboard, right? And easy.
Yep.
You know,
Yes.
the most expensive and hardest place to fix a bug is when you're in production. Act accordingly, right? And so
And it's the
anytime you
same
have
true
something that
for-
escapes out to the right,
Yeah.
once you've mitigated and kind of dealt with the stemmed the bleeding, if you will, you got to have that retrospective of, okay, how could we have caught this over here? What could we be doing or not doing, do more of, do less of, to catch this here and not, you know, all the way over to the right? I realize that's sort of
and security vulnerabilities are just a very specific kind of bug, realistically.
Yes.
Like
yes.
that's what they are.
And I'll argue that to till the cows come home, right? And I've gotten in conversations, you know, with people about this who say, well, security problems are the worst problems because my credit card number will get disclosed. Well, getting 100 times the amount of radiation you're supposed to get in radiation therapy, that's kind of a bad bug too, and I wouldn't call that a security bug. So
No.
Quality is quality. Security is very important. So is, you know, quality is an aspect of it. But it's also one of those things where when it happens, the impact is huge, you know, because the impact generally isn't, oh, 50 people were affected. It's 50 million people were affected.
Because it immediately scales, right? Yes. And I find it interesting. So I was thinking a little bit about this slide after you and I had talked in preparation here, because the question we asked wasn't, where do you implement most of your security measures? What we asked was, where do you spend most of your time implementing those measures?
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm theorizing a little bit, but I'm betting the 33% of the people who are spending most of their time post-build are actually implementing less security measures than the people who are spending it, you know, before build.
Yeah, you know, maybe a charitable way to interpret this data would be, you know, 36% before the build. That means you're paying attention to architecture, you're paying attention to design and the code as you're writing it. During the build, hey, let's say you're doing scanning, you know, you're doing, you know, vulnerability scanning, you're checking your supply chain for vulnerabilities, you know, all of those sorts of things. Post build, charitably, maybe what you're doing is you're continuing to do scans against your live production system. You're doing penetration,
some monitoring and penetration testing,
yeah,
right?
all of those sorts of things. Or you could take the less charitable approach of, well, 33% post builds means you're basically testing in production. So,
right. So it's a little hard to tell, but I do find it interesting that it was about the time spent, because ideally your time should be mostly spent implementing security measures before the build.
You'll spend a lot less time that way, that's for sure. I mean, I think commensurate with the cost, I think it's almost certain that the amount of time and the amount of resources go up, you know, as you go to the right. So yeah.
So here's where I bring in my open source stuff, which is, you know, my passion, of course, which is, you know, for open source specifically, because that is the biggest attack surface for code, because it's shared, it's public, and all the vulnerabilities are public.
Yeah.
So it's why it's important to keep up to date and to know what open source you have. So this one is pretty specific on what stage of the software development lifecycle do you spend most of your time implementing open source security measures.
Yep.
And generally speaking, what we see is the people who are smart enough and with it enough and building it enough to understand that open source is the major attack vector, or surface more accurately, then they're doing it pre-built, right? They're doing it as early as they can. Because that makes the most sense. That's when you're using it. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you have to think about it in terms of, to generalize a little bit more, I would say you have to think about your supply chain, right? If you're a restaurant, right, you think about your food supply chain. Where is my food coming from? Is it sustainably, you know, grown or harvested or caught? Is it clean? You know, is it fresh? You know, has it been stored in the right temperature at all times? All of those sorts of things. You know, that's what you think about when you're in the food service, right? You think about the quality of your supply chain in all the various aspects of how you care about that with food. Well, software is this, you know, is the same. Whether you're relying on open source third-party software or closed source or commercial or what have you, that is your software supply chain. You need to manage the quality, the cleanliness, if you will, of your supply chain. and think about that. And that means you need to know what you have in your product, what are the ingredients that go into your dish, right? Where do they come from? Who works on those? You know,
the traceability is essential. You need to
absolutely.
have it traceable. I cut my teeth in medical devices, combination hardware and software. And, I knew where every screw and every machine we shipped came from.
Yeah.
And that's,
And I mean,
what you have to do.
It's interesting because this is something that people in the PLM world, the product lifecycle management,
Yep.
as opposed to the application lifecycle management, the notion of a bill of materials, right, is fundamental to supply chain management in the physical world. We're not as fundamental yet, at least, about our supply chain and bill of materials, the electronic bill of materials that go into the software that we ship or that we put into production. Some of us are, most of us aren't. I'll go so far as to say, look, how many of us know whether or not our build processes use HTTPS or HTTP when fetching open source libraries from third-party public repositories? The vast majority of us are probably not using encryption when we fetch third-party open source libraries. That means you're vulnerable to a man-in-the-middle attack.
Yes.
Are you even checking the checksums? Are you, all of those things? And so there's a lot of sort of, if you go back in the kitchen and look a little bit, you might find some pretty scary things in most of our software kitchens, if you will.
Just to hammer home your point, because what we're both talking about is different regulatory schemes, right? For your restaurant, for your medical device,
Yep.
you got actually it's weirdly the FDA for both of them. But realistically, the software industry is immature compared to those industries.
Yeah.
And you already hear rumblings about things like accountability for software security, because the impact can be so great to an entire society that Boeing's planes or something, you can't just trust everybody to do the best they can and follow industry best practices, quote unquote. We're probably not all that far off from having some sort of regulatory body that demands things like a bill of materials.
Yeah. Well, and in most regulated environments, we're pretty close to that already. I mean, if you're in finance,
we got ISO stuff, right?
Aerospace, you've already got a lot of things around separation of duty and traceability and all of the kind of governance aspects of that. A lot of those things, I mean, coming out of the world of automation and orchestration, I've said for years and years, automation is auditing, right?
Yeah.
If you boil it down to its core essence, or at least from my perspective, the core essence, what does an auditor want? An auditor wants you to document what you do and then prove that you do what you document. There's more to it than that, obviously, but if you do those two things well, everything else kind of place, right? Yeah. Automation, if you have a broad end-to-end automation for your software pipeline, that is your documentation of what you do. The runtime record of that then gives you the proof that you did what you documented. And if you use robust platforms where you can do all of these things as code, you can even do code reviews when you make changes to your software pipeline and involve everybody in that. So it's
for your pipeline being treated as code, we could do a whole webinar just on that concept.
Oh, and I have. I mean, that's I've spent years making that happen. So we're all over that. But that's why I say automation is auditing, because it forces you to, it forces you to do things like value stream mapping, to really understand, kind of the way I put it is, take a GoPro camera and put it on the head of your source code, and then follow your source code from when it comes out of your developer's fingers all the way to when it's in production and used by your customers. And if you don't at some point understand all the steps that goes through, you need to. Somebody needs to organizationally understand that so that they can be automated, replicated, be made reliable, fixed, updated, evolved, all of those sorts of things.
Like everything else with a process, right?
Yep.
All right, so last piece here, and I think we're running out of time, so we're going to go a little quicker. I'm going to be aggressive now on timing. So, look, the important piece here is you can't do this with just process and just people, right? Tooling is necessary to actually implement DevSecOps at a realistic scale.
Absolutely.
It goes back to automation and putting it in every single phase. But the idea here is automation, right? Like you were just talking about. If you're not automating this, you can't really scale it. You can't measure it well. And more importantly, it's not transferable.
Yeah.
So, that kind of leads us to, yes, kind of the obvious conclusion. Developers need robust tools that fit into their workflows. to enable all of the other pieces we're talking about. The tools are never enough. Necessary but not sufficient, to use that overused phrase, right?
Yep.
You need process, people, culture changes,
Yep.
all of that.
Yep.
But the tooling is necessary.
There's at least 3 legs on that stool: people, process,
Yes.
tools, right? So any 2 done well will get you a very wobbly stool. So you need to do at least 3 to get going.
And look, one thing we like to talk about a lot is prioritization. The
Yep.
problem with vulnerabilities, it's like the problem with every other kind of defect. You have to prioritize them. One of the ways we prioritize is by seeing which vulnerabilities are actually being called. So if you have a vulnerable method in a library you're using, that's one thing. If you're calling that vulnerable method, that's a much higher likelihood of attack surface.
And that's a huge deal. I mean, I think it's important to kind of emphasize how important that is, right? Because if anybody who's ever dealt with getting security scans back, that the most common form is you get a 500-page PDF document.
Yeah,
and brutal. It's, as far as I can tell, usually sorted randomly. That's probably not technically true, but the signal
it's
to noise
sorted
rate,
based on something, but sometimes it's not even clear. Yeah. Right.
The signal to noise ratio is just all wrong. And of course, if you tend to do this the way, kind of in the old school way of you wait till it's too late, of course that the output of the tool is going to be that much bigger and that much more confusing. So the kind of prioritization is so important, because you run any kind of scan on any significant piece of software that uses any even smattering of open source tools, you're going to have a folder full of potential vulnerabilities. Some of these frameworks are quite large, right? I mean, if you're thinking about Hibernate or Spring or those sorts of things, those frameworks have thousands of APIs. So just the fact that you have a vulnerable version doesn't mean that you need to go, kind of run around like you've got your head cut off. It may mean that you have some time to mitigate. You may not, in fact, even be vulnerable at all. So the signal to noise ratio is really important, and tools that pay attention to that are the tools that people find really valuable.
Right, and there's so many other vectors here too for prioritization, right? Obviously there's simple pieces like what part of your code is it touching, right? You prioritize your e-commerce vulnerabilities a little bit higher than you do for a pure UI thing where somebody can inject a new name on a button, right? But you also have things like the CVSS scores. I always want to say CVS, like the pharmacy. So the CVSS scores,
or the version control
you,
system, if you're of my vintage.
And then the other piece is, realistically, you actually there are such a thing as vulnerabilities you can't remediate. Somebody's disclosed a bug that's essential to a library that you're using in your application, but the fix isn't out yet. It happens, not often, but it does happen.
Yeah. Or the fix is in the hands of your cloud provider, right? Because it's not, it's an infrastructure vulnerability, not not an application vulnerability.
Another thing, all you can do is basically bug your vendor, right?
Yeah.
That piece of your supply chain.
Yep.
Or if you're getting code from a third-party commercial component that is also consisting of open source, right? So it's not just prioritization, it's what am I going to do about it? How am I going to remediate this?
Yep.
And we found that actually, just from our own stuff, in our own surveys and our own customers, what we call effective, whether or not you're calling the vulnerable method, it was around 30% of the total amount of vulnerabilities you get back on a scan. So it's obviously great to be able to prioritize that 30% and make sure you fix those first.
Yeah, and I'd be happy to get the result back that it was 30% was effective, right? Because I suspect it's maybe even higher for a lot of people, where or lower in terms of effectiveness. Because I know myself, when we get scans back, oh, we use this library. Well, we only use this little tiny percentage of it. So in fact, this vulnerability is important. Now that doesn't mean, I don't think we should be saying, hey, just because we're not making a call into the vulnerable part, that maybe we shouldn't upgrade.
You can make that call tomorrow. It's a problem.
Exactly.
It's
Right?
just not as obvious a problem.
It's a prioritization issue, right? Because there's always going to be more work to do than there are fingers to do the typing.
By the way, the other one I see a decent amount of is just libraries that aren't even being called at all. They're just included.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I'm like, yeah, that drives me nuts. I'm like, stop that.
Yeah. I think the most common kind of thing I see there is people end up shipping JUnit. Because
Yes.
they don't tag the dependency as a test dependency, and you ship all your test libraries.
So we've hit the summary slide. So I think it's good. We can probably take questions now. But this was basically just summing up everything we talked about. My next slide is basically just more of the same. It's, hey, you want to avoid all these bottlenecks. You've got to make it everybody's responsibility. And it's not just about tooling, although that's necessary. You also need to use that tooling to basically make sure that people are having meaningful discussions that are effective and efficient about security. And that's how you embed it across the entire cycle.
I couldn't have said it better.
Cool. I love it. Thanks. All right. I'm doing that because I love the Q&A parts. I was burning through it. So
Okay, well, you guys didn't leave a whole lot of time for question and answer, unfortunately, because normally we'd like close it off now. But I'm going to let us do one quick question. It's got to be quick, guys. It's got to be quick. So let's go ahead.
You know
and
your
dive
audience
right
with
in.
us too.
I know, and I know you guys, which is why I'm telling you it's got to be quick. Okay, so let's see. Since we keep adding more responsibility into those full stack teams, how do you suggest to solve the improving capacity of team members, assuming it needs improvement?
Oh,
Ooh, interesting
30
one.
seconds or less.
I'm gonna let you go first, Anders. I don't know if I'm being polite or selfish.
So I think, so first of all, the question assumes that you're measuring that accurately, right? And that's a very difficult thing to measure. So I might push back on the question a little bit even, but I mean, I think it's, as with all metrics, I would, and this falls under the area of metrics, I would say understand the outcome that you're seeking, right? Don't look for, hey, the number of closed issues, and then measure only that. Think about the outcome that you want. So if the outcome that you want is less bugs, happier customers, maybe looking at closed issues isn't the right thing to measure, because maybe what you'll do is you'll just induce a behavior where developers or support people just close issues more often, right? Or earlier than they should. So as with all metrics and improvements, I think it's understand the outcome that you're seeking, make sure that the metrics that you're looking at are in service of that outcome. And then when you achieve the outcome, look for other metrics and other outcomes that you want to achieve.
So I have a one-word answer to add on to yours, which was perfect, which is automation.
Yeah.
You want more capacity, you want more efficiency, automate.
And also training. Don't underestimate the value of training your people, your employees. We did a panel webinar in this just the other day, and there's a great anecdote that gets thrown out of a CFO and a CTO are talking, and the CFO tells the CTO, hey, why do you want to spend so much time training your people? What if they just leave and work for our competitors? And the CTO says, well, what if we don't train them and they stay?
Exactly.
There you go.
So with that, we should throw it over to Charlene and let's see who won the actual drawing.
You. Thanks, Jeffrey. Thanks to everybody who did submit questions. I'm sorry if we didn't get to yours, but please know that both Jeffrey and Anders will be getting a copy of all of the audience questions. So then I'm sure somebody from their organization will be more than happy to follow up with you offline. Okay, without further ado, let's go ahead and do that Amazon gift card drawing. Our first winner today is Johnny C. Congratulations, Johnny. And our second winner today is Sean S. S-H-A-W-N. So congratulations to both Johnny and Sean. We'll be following up with you via email to get your gift card out to you. And I also want to remind the audience real quick that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of the event, or if you just want to watch it again, you'll have the opportunity to do so. We are going to be sending out an email after today's webinar that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And the webinar is also going to be living on the DevOps.com website, so you can always go look for it there. Just go to DevOps.com/webinars, look in the on-demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. Jeffrey, Anders, great presentation. As always, stimulating conversation, lots of questions you guys have to follow up on. So thanks very much, appreciate it.
It was fun.
It's always fun, guys.
All
Thank you
right,
very much.
all right. Also want to thank the audience for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Stay safe, stay sane, and enjoy your day.